Hi, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join us today for our webinar titled Inside the 2019 Advocacy Survey, Benchmarking Your Organization. My name is Helena Purides, and I'm with the marketing team here at Phone to Action. So I want to thank everyone for joining us, and I'd just like to quickly walk you through a few housekeeping items. We will be live tweeting the event using hashtag Advocacy Survey 2019. We invite you to follow along and contribute and tag at Phone to Action on Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. You have two choices for how to listen to the event: over your computer speakers or by dialing in over the phone. If you run into problems with your computer's audio, please call into the number provided by GoToWebinar. Next, we are recording this event, and we will be sending the link to all registrants along with the slide deck after the webinar has ended. Finally, after the presentation, we will have some time for questions. To submit a question for us, please type your question into the questions box on your control panel. If you run into any technical difficulties during today's presentation, please contact us via the chat window and I will assist you. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's moderator, Singer Crawford.
Thank you so much, Helena. Hi, everybody. My name is Singer Crawford, and I lead up our digital partnerships team here at Phone to Action. I've been at the company for about 2 years, but before that, I was actually a client myself and worked for 4 years in digital grassroots and education advocacy. I'm a really big fan of running, as you can see. I love it almost as much as I love running campaigns and digital advocacy, and I love dad jokes as well. But before I go too far down that rabbit hole, I'd love to introduce our 3 esteemed panelists now, starting with Karen Spangler from the Food Policy Action Organization. Karen is the Director of Policy and Program Operations at Food Policy Action and has over a decade of experience in advocacy. Next up, we're joined by Eric Steenstra, the President of Vote Hemp, with a whopping 19 years of experience in digital advocacy and grassroots. Last but certainly not least, we're joined by Katrina Yoshida, Policy Engagement and Manager at ACE Scholarships. We're so excited to have her today because she brings a wide range of advocacy, activism, and fundraising experience to our discussion. Wonderful. We're so thrilled to have you all with us today to discuss the results of our 2019 Advocacy Survey. As some of you may remember, earlier this year, we released our inaugural State of Advocacy report, which highlighted some of our industry's best practices. So what we wanted to do was follow that up with a survey on what you as advocacy professionals actually think about grassroots work in our modern age. We're going to start today's webinar with a discussion on the survey. Then we're going to go into some political context around what advocacy has looked like this past year. Then we're going to review our biggest challenges and needs, discuss some audience engagement, and then finally we'll wrap up with a review of advocacy tools. So let's get started. So the 2019 Advocacy Survey. What are we surveying and why? Who responded to us? What were our findings? Well, before we jump into the specifics, let's actually start with a recap of what our State of Advocacy report found. We rounded up data on what advocacy organizations do and compiled some unique insights to what works and what doesn't. And in fact, we found that there's been a 700% uptick, for example, in public comments to regulatory agencies. But now what we want to do is look into the future and find out how experts are doing this work. So we rounded up some advocacy professionals like yourselves in a variety of industries so that we can understand their audience response, their engagement, how they're looking at success, how the 2020 election and the census is going to impact their work, and finally, what their biggest challenges were. So looking at the total of 85 advocacy respondents, we found that the majority work in nonprofits, although there was certainly a plurality that are policy managers and directors of advocacy, with a handful at the C-suite level. So with such a wide range of perspectives and positions, what were our respondents' main takeaways? So the top 3 things that we learned: 1, the industry still wants to influence and improve their engagement with advocates, which makes sense. We're always seeking to improve the ways that we're communicating and garnering responses from our supporters. 2, unfortunately, the majority of organizations are still using some antiquated technology to actually reach the goal of getting more advocates. And finally, while capacity and a lack of resources certainly continue to put a strain on advocacy professionals, they actually have more to focus on than just team size and resources. All right, let's get into the details. To whom and where are organizations directing the majority of their advocacy efforts? Well, our survey found that state legislation has a slight increase over federal legislation. Eric, maybe you could speak to us about what tier of government your organization is focusing its policy efforts on.
Sure. So currently we're focusing more on a regulatory approach, but our organization may be unique to some. For a number of years, we were advocating for a policy change at the federal government level and also at the state level to request that farmers would be once again able to grow hemp as a commercial crop. And so originally our strategy was to work largely with states to create generate pressure and through state legislation, and then also simultaneously working to educate federal legislators and press for legislation. And so, but now we've shifted because the 2018 Farm Bill included a provision that legalized hemp farming and now created allowed or authorized USDA to create regulations around that. We're in the process of working to get comments submitted to the USDA at the moment. So that's where we've kind of shifted a little bit more towards that.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Eric. I'd be really curious, Katrina, to hear where you all are focusing your advocacy efforts next year, given the interesting position that ACE finds themselves in.
Yeah, so ACE Scholarships works in 8 different states, and so we kind of focus a lot on the state legislature, just because we feel like education policy makes the most impact on the state level than it does maybe on the federal level of things. However, we have worked with federal agencies. We had a bunch of comments that were sent to the IRS when some credit was going through, and so it's kind of what we're working on, but the state legislature is kind of why we most focus in on.
That's wonderful. I think one of the more interesting findings of our survey is that the current climate of all this increased polarization has actually not really made that much of a difference. As you can see here, not that many people are saying it's making it impactful one way or another. Karen, do you agree with the findings of the survey?
Well, it's interesting. FPA is a nonpartisan organization, so we believe that safe, affordable, healthy food shouldn't be polarized, but it hasn't been easy to get members to step out of line with their party for common sense solutions. So for us, it's made it more difficult to make progress, even though it's really easy to come up with examples of how things like food assistance or food deserts impact people in rural areas, urban areas, all kinds of political leanings. But getting people to act has become increasingly difficult. There are a few bright spots, in my opinion. Throwing out some of the old political compromise assumptions has freed up people to push for issues like farming solutions to help fight climate change that weren't part of the dialogue even a few years ago.
That's a really interesting point, and I think is in direct contrast to where Eric lies on the hemp issue. So I'd be really curious to see kind of the counterpoint from your position at Vote Hemp.
Yeah, we are similarly nonpartisan organization. We've always focused on trying to emphasize the benefits to farmers, to businesses, and to the environment that allowing hemp to be grown as a crop would provide. And so sometimes we would tailor our messages, to one particular, to members based on their interests. But in general, we always saw this as a nonpartisan issue, and we worked very hard to get both sides of the aisle to support it. And our first big breakthrough in 2014, we actually had an amendment that was placed onto the 2014 Farm Bill. We managed to get 162 Democrats and 63 Republicans to vote in favor of that amendment. And I thought that was a great sort of example of a bipartisan vote. And we found that, this became a very bipartisan thing. through those efforts to the point where we had, Senator McConnell and Senator Schumer, the majority and minority leaders, co-sponsoring legislation along with a bunch of their colleagues. So it wasn't easy, and I think it's, it is very difficult, especially on certain issues that tend to be, affiliated with one side or the other. But I think there are ways to work even in this, difficult polarized environment that we have.
That's such a good point. I don't know if anybody listening today was listening to the news this morning. I mean, we have an impeachment hearing going on, but at the same time, we were able to pass USMCA, and the Space Force got its initial boots off the ground. So you're absolutely right. There's some interesting agreements and collaboration that can happen during these polarized times, which is actually a really great segue into what is going to be coming down the pike in 2020. And again, very interestingly enough, we found that there's pretty much a 50-50 split between those who are planning on leveraging this election and this momentous occasion for advocacy next year and those that aren't. Do you all think that, this finding actually maps to what you all are preparing for next year? I'd actually love to hear from all of you. Maybe, Katrina, you can go ahead and get started talking about your Get Out the Vote efforts for next year.
Yeah, so just like Karen and Eric, we're a nonpartisan organization and we're a 501c3, so we can't really get involved in any elections or electioneering, but we will be encouraging people to vote, anybody register to vote, since we work with a low-income population, and that population doesn't always get, engaged in voting, and so it's a really great opportunity with the 2020 election, since there's so much momentum around it, to encourage people to vote and to encourage them to register to vote. The 2020 election will probably have affect our 2020 legislation season, but other than that, we're really not getting involved.
Interesting. What about you, Karen? How are you all going to be leveraging, if at all, next year's election for your advocacy program?
Yeah, we have engaged in the election in some way every cycle since Food Policy Action was founded in 2012. We have both a C3 and a C4, the Food Policy Action and an education fund. And so we've engaged in some targeted independent expenditures in the past to help connect the dots for voters on their members' food policy record and how it directly affects them and their families. So we have that ability to engage as well as doing C3 work. And definitely food policy is as an issue is still emerging. And so we need to keep raising the profile of it and how it touches on people's health, the economy, people's personal budgets in ways that candidates might not directly speak to.
That's such a good point, Karen. I think we all have a lot to learn about how Get Out the Vote and election strategy goes beyond simply promoting an individual candidate, but actually encompasses issue advocacy and informing upcoming candidates. So our survey actually found that a near majority of people will spend 2020 advocate for issues, but over half will also do some Get Out the Vote efforts. So, Eric, I'd love to hear more about your strategy for the new year, whether that's going to start around Iowa caucusing or the primaries in the summer, or if you're just going to wait until closer to the general election.
Yeah, so historically, we've done a lot to educate our advocates and the community around where lawmakers stood on the issue, and tried to to encourage people to reach out to them and to support candidates that supported our issue. So, but I think we're going to be doing less advocacy this year around the election because we've shifted from a advocacy role a little bit more towards the implementation phase here with the USDA issuing regulations. And so I don't see us taking as big a role in doing advocacy around it. We will be promoting, encouraging advocates to vote and to be aware and to speak to their policymakers, but a little less than we have in the past.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I definitely think that matches with what our findings have shown here, that people will certainly be using the election to encourage advocacy and civic involvement. But I'd be curious to hear from anyone who wants to speak to this, if you're leveraging unique tactics or strategies around the election? I know, Karen, you mentioned some independent expenditures, so I'd be curious if you all are going to be doing any kind of text message mobilization or get out the vote in-person drives, surveys around candidates, et cetera.
Yeah, definitely. We definitely have found that the mobilization is going to be huge for us. We've done C4 IE work in the past, but in 2018, we found the most effective approach was to increase turnout, just work on increasing turnout with C3 public education work. And that was sort of the way to cut through some of the hyperpartisan noise by taking a more down to earth educational approach. And we'll probably do that again in 2020. So both kind of individual communications and then also some kind of authentic feeling communications from people like our chef advocates that we work with across the country who can speak to voters in a kind of trusted voice from somebody who is within their community.
I love that so much. All three of you seem to have the most fun kind of advocates and supporters to mobilize. So moving on, I would love to focus next on how advocacy professionals are defining success. A plurality of our advocates and respondents say they focus on increasing the number of messages sent to lawmakers, but they also measure it by advocate acquisition, social media engagement, and then all-around email metrics, including open rates and click-through numbers. So as you're preparing for next year's legislative sessions, which, as we all know, are right around the corner, kick out the gate in January, a major census is coming up, and there's a presidential year, as we just talked about. So, Eric, maybe you could speak to first how you're setting your key performance indicators for next year.
Yeah, so our goal with all of our advocates is to kind of move them up the advocacy ladder. A lot of times they start out following us on social media and just becoming aware of the issue. And our goal is to get them to be more engaged. And our ultimate goal is to get them to take action when something comes up in their state and we need them to advocate for a specific bill or a policy with the state government, or at the federal level when we have something. We also do like to encourage people to recognize that, our work is dependent on donations. And so we look to try to get them engaged on that as well. But our main goal is really to get that engagement by taking action when it's necessary.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think the analogy of the advocacy ladder is so crucial to this kind of work, and would be curious how that maps over to your experience engaging your own advocates, Katrina.
Yeah, it's similar to Eric. I mean, we're trying to find those key community leaders that can really rally their community and their schools and get involved and want to come to the Capitol and testify or want to send letters to the legislator. So, I mean, it is getting those numbers down to those few key people that are willing to do a little bit more work. But I think ultimately, it's defining success for us would be passing legislation. So sometimes that takes, thousands of emails or calls to a legislator to move something, and sometimes it just means a few key dedicated people to show up at the Capitol and to share their story. So at the end of the day, we want to pass legislation and we want to see things passed. So sometimes the means can look different.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and something that wasn't necessarily elevated in our survey responses, which is that sometimes it doesn't take advocate acquisition in terms of supporters, but really driving home key relationships with both individual lawmakers as well as stakeholders in the community. And I think 8 Scholarships is a really good example of that, given that they are trying to cultivate relationships with school leaders as opposed to the students and the teachers, although I know that that's definitely part of your strategy as well. So definitely a really good nugget of knowledge for people to take away. This is actually a really interesting transition to some of our advocacy group's biggest challenges. So we found that a majority of people feel that their teams are understaffed, underfunded. This is probably going to sound pretty familiar with you. You might be shaking your head for those of you joining us at home. But surprisingly, many also said it's getting increasingly difficult to actually move people to action, whether that's because there's an increasing number of organizations out there and a plurality or a lot of different types of ways that you can advocate. I think what's most surprising to me, though, is just how many said they lack a cohesive strategy. Karen, I know you've been with Food Policy Action for a really long time now, and you've probably implemented a ton of different strategies. So I'd be really curious to understand how your organization has overcome these challenges.
Mm, yeah, definitely. I think it can be very hard to move people to action. I think right now people can be very skeptical of whether their action will make an impact given the state of the world. And as I mentioned, food policy as an industry is still in its startup years. And so having staff who can invest time in understanding and really fully utilizing platforms like Phone to Action is not always a given. I've done my best, but I'm certainly, I don't only specialize in our digital work, right? And it changes pretty quickly, the landscape of digital advocacy right now. We try to address some of these challenges by articulating to people why their particular action will make a difference. So, like this year, we've been fighting back against moves by the Trump administration to cut food stamps 3 separate times through regulatory action, and this can really wear down even active members of the public. So when we're trying to generate comments, we invest in trying to explain what makes an effective comment, why this particular challenge is particularly important, and letting people know that the regulatory process that the government has to read and address the comments, and so they're offering this personal experience of their story. It's not going to be in vain, even if it might feel like it. And then, of course, when we get wins, the failure of the hyperpartisan House Farm Bill in May 2018, we really let people know how their action helped that happen and try to give them opportunities to thank legislators or share about it so that they get that experience of satisfaction.
Yeah, I think that speaks beautifully to Eric's point about moving folks up the advocacy ladder. You want them to not just feel like you're knocking on their door when you need something, although for all 3 of your organizations and for everyone else, there are plenty of opportunities to take action, but making sure that they're able to share their own story and demonstrate some gratitude for all the work that legislators have done, which I think creates a really nice cohesive relationship with both legislators and your advocates. So, Katrina, perhaps you could discuss when it comes to resourcing your work. I know that you all are a small shop. What have you found works best?
I think it's like utilizing tools like Phone to Action and having a little bit of that, I guess, digital support and other organizations, but it is being strategic and being smart about things, just knowing that you're not going to get to everything. And prioritizing. I feel like most organizations really know that, but just kind of choosing your battles to kind of understand that when you're a small shop, that you got to figure out how you're going to make the biggest impact. And I think it is this is why we focus so much on finding those few key community leaders, because in a sense they're kind of taking the mantle and sharing their stories and engaging their community, which has this ripple effect on things. And so that's why we focus so much on trying to find those people that are going to, that want to take the torch and pass it on to the rest of their community.
Right. It's kind of like a train the trainer model where you're cultivating advocacy experts in the community who can then go out and reach more people so that you can have that major impact. I like that.
Exactly.
Yeah. As advocacy professionals, we also know that there are challenges to moving the needle that come simply from moving people to action and how difficult that can be. There's just so much noise out there right now, and about a quarter of our respondents say that even if they had enough resources and the full team's worth of capacity, it would still be really challenging to break through. Karen and Eric, can each of you maybe share how you've dealt with these respective moving the needle issues, if you will?
Sure, this is Eric. Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Karen.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Okay. So for us, I think we face the same challenges that a lot of these organizations have with regards to just getting people to take action. I think if you think about how the productivity level we have now with cell phones and, everything that there's just so much information coming at people. And I think a lot of times people are getting so many messages. I know I am, and it's hard to make your message become, a top priority. So I think, it's important to send out regular communication to your advocates, letting them know about the important issues that are going on and why, taking action could make a difference and how it makes a difference directly to them. And so that's what we really try to emphasize in getting advocates to consider taking action. I think some of the tools that Phone to Action has added for us has really helped. I know that the text messaging portion of it, I think has been especially helpful. I find that emails are harder and harder to get through as far as the number of people that are taking action on those.
Yeah, I definitely think that having a combination of tools is especially helpful because we find that, email is great because we're directly reaching people. Texting is great because we're directly reaching people. Social media helps to extend the reach and to kind of reach that audience of people who might be tangentially interested but not yet have food policy on their radar. And so having all of those together, including then the ability to like funnel them into up that ladder of engagement has been really helpful.
Absolutely. And I think as we go into the needs, you'll find that these very much match what you all were just saying and how they correspond to the challenges. I would love to hear from all of you. Maybe Katrina, you can start. If you all were granted 3 wishes from an advocacy genie, what would your biggest needs be? Would they match what you're seeing on our survey results, or is there one thing in particular that you would absolutely want to help you?
I think one thing that maybe is not on these results is just kind of the follow through. It's kind of that retention of people. I think so often we're either trying to pass something or something comes up that we're trying to stop, and you like sound the alarms and you're calling everybody and calling the troops to come in and to get involved, to talk to the legislator, to tell all their friends about something, but it's really retaining those people and continuing that conversation throughout the year, or when there's an off year, or there's, you're not trying to pass anything or nothing comes up, is retaining those people and continuing that conversation. I think that's like one thing that's maybe not on here that if I had the one wish, I would really, really love.
That's so interesting. I like the idea of advocate retention and finding ways to provide automatic follow through. I know, Karen, you mentioned that you all try to provide value that's beyond simply a call to action, giving people chances to share their story. Are there any other ways that you all are driving advocate retention, or are there anything else on this list that you think would help you be more effective in your advocacy work?
Yeah, definitely. We try to include we try to have retention strategies that give people opportunities to level up their engagement. So that's been things like working with people who were petition signers, and then once we have a need for action for a targeted legislator for calls, then we personally follow up with them and ask them to take the lead on mobilizing calls, or coming even in person for in-person advocacy. One of the biggest things that would obviously help with that would be funding. I think that food policy is still an emerging issue, and growing the audience for that, both with funding and the awareness of it, is still in its nascent stages, and that's a challenge when you're trying to do cutting edge work. There's a common saying in the food world to vote with your fork or vote with your dollars, but that's not going to be enough on its own to change the playing field for everybody. And so we're building awareness. You need to vote with your vote to make progress. And that continues to, represent challenges when we're trying to meet all of our program needs with funding.
That's super helpful and definitely an honest answer for sure. We all wish that there was more funding for these issues because you would be able to really hear more people speak. And I think the idea of some personal follow-up and providing in-person advocacy opportunities is a great way for us to drive right into some communication tactics. So, what are people thinking about when it comes to engaging their supporters? The majority, we found, say that they connect at least once a week or once every other week. I think that what's interesting here is that about the majority or the plurality of people that responded here, so they only reach out about once a month. I don't want to bias my answers or my questions here, but I would love to hear from you, Eric, first, how you think this corresponds to how frequently you're engaging with advocates, and definitely feel free to break it down by how you consider your communication, whether that's texting versus email versus in-person opportunities.
Yeah. So, our most frequent area of communication is through social media. So we have a lot of followers, on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and we can communicate with them, sort of on an ongoing, multiple times a day. Typically, we're putting out different information, just news updates, and then sometimes action alerts and that type of thing. But I think when it comes to email and it's a little less frequent. We're typically doing it. Sometimes it's weekly if there's a lot going on, but sometimes it'll be every 2 weeks or even occasionally once a month. But then when it comes to text messaging, we really keep that focused on alerts that we want people to take action with. We find that we don't want to. We really like that. The way to reach people, we don't want them to unsubscribe, so we try to be really selective on when we use text messaging for communication.
Yeah, I think that's really smart. We do have to be very aware of the effect that our communications can have on advocate behavior. Karen, can you talk about your strategy for getting the highest conversions from your advocates?
Yeah, we find the frequency of effective communications for us really varies because we work on federal issues, and so we are very dependent on the congressional calendar and the election cycles. So when we have certain critical food issues that are coming to a tipping point, like with farm bill votes or regulatory comments, we might communicate weekly or even daily, and those will be quite short and have a pretty specific call to action. And that's where something like texting or even social media becomes useful because it's less it feels less bombarding than constant emails. But then the challenge for us is how to provide opportunities for engagement when we're hurry up and waiting, which is one of the things that can happen where we find that we hear the issue is going to come up. We want to be prepared, want to be mobilized. We're going to tell our audience that this is happening this year. And then, we're waiting and waiting and waiting. So this is where things like petitions or using a lot of opportunities for supporters to share about things on social media or education like webinars are useful for building power and educating people while you're waiting to mobilize and hopefully keep them interested.
Right. I think that's really interesting. I think you all are creatively considering how you can engage with your audience. I'd be really curious, given that about 2/3 of our respondents said that, advocates really aren't responding well. It doesn't really matter how frequently they're engaging. They're just often left wondering, is anybody even out there? So, Karen, how exactly are you all measuring whether people are, at a high quality level engaging with your communication, with these webinars, with these emails and these text messages?
Definitely looking at the straight stats is great. That's really nice to be able to see both new and repeated advocates, right? Because that tells me something about people who took action for the first time, people who are taking action for repeated times. Earlier this year, late last year, actually the Phone to Action support staff helped me segment some of our list into repeated action taker advocates so we could sort of see who the most active people were. Qualitatively, we love hearing back from people after they've contacted their legislators. The amount of sharing people do about it on social media, that tells us the degree of sort of a proxy for the enthusiasm that people have, not just that they did it, but that they shared about it. And the level of detail or personalization that people put into the contents of emails or comments or social media posts. How much are they customizing it? Because that tells us about the quality of the engagement and how personal it is to them.
I love that. I think that's really, really smart and definitely something that you can find out by looking at the messages that were sent to lawmakers or exploring hashtags related to your calls to action on social media. And on that line of calls to action, I know, Katrina, you have a specific example you wanted to share about how well you're not getting people to respond to your calls to action.
No, we actually had a really great case in Colorado here where we sent out an email to our families. I was just getting them to send a letter to the legislators on a very non-sexy issue that we originally didn't think our families would be interested in. And they ended up sending so many different emails. We had over 3,000 connections, and I actually got this issue was higher on the most looked at bills than a controversial sex ed bill here in Colorado. So I think, some of that was just, kind of like what Karen said, just segmenting the audience and knowing who we were talking to. There's a lot of personal emails to different schools. And again, it's like that ripple effect of things is finding that one key person. And we're unique in the fact that we get to work in schools. And so it's like finding that unique person in the school that finds that issue interesting or knows that it's going to value their community and will send it out to the rest of their communities, and then they send it out. And so it really creates this big ripple effect. And just having that really strong, strong call to action, and also knowing where it's at within an email. I think sometimes or email or text messages, sometimes you can get lost in a lot of words, but just making sure that it's really visible to see.
Absolutely. And I think when we consider calls to action, it's always helpful to be as clear and concise as possible, because our supporters are, they have a lot that they're doing per day, and just understanding exactly what you need from them can be very helpful. Eric, I know that you've found it's certainly harder to reach people on email, and you've just had some low response rates compared to texting. Could you speak a little bit on that?
Yeah, we've really been seeing it's been more challenging to get through on email. We've tried different tactics using, I've done some research on subject lines, for example, to try to increase open rates, and some of that can be helpful. And I think that's probably the number one thing. I think a lot of people scan through their emails and don't even open them. So that's probably my number one recommendation to try to increase, open rates on emails would be to look at, creative ways to use subject lines. And there's some good, webinars and things out there on that. But yeah, we've just seen, I think people are just getting bombarded with so much information in their email. And so, again, it's been, harder and harder to get through as far as taking action on that. So, we do depend on all the channels, social media, text messaging, and email. We try to, just hit people with all the options, and hopefully we are able to reach as many as possible by effectively doing that.
Absolutely. And I think that's a perfect segue into our final section of the survey, which is about advocacy tools and that variety of things that you're using to be effective. So what types of tools did our survey respondents say they wanted most? It looks like email was at the top of the list, followed closely by social media, and then professional advocacy software. So, Karen, what types of tools make up the majority of your toolbox?
Yeah, definitely. We're right up there, I would say, with most of the respondents in terms of the power of email. We use our email list for fundraising and for continuing to kind of grow this awareness and educated public on food issues, as well as advocacy. So for us, it's critical to keep growing our list. And we've been able to sync phone to action automatically as we acquire new advocates, so that if they opt in, they'll get our emails, and that's really helpful. I mean, the power of email and the direct mobile communications, like Eric was talking about, is that these are people that we already know are at least a little bit interested. Um, then the organic social media definitely helps us to grow our audience because um, those are the people that, again, we're trying to build this awareness of food policy as an issue, and so we have to keep touching the people who may not know that they're interested yet, but we think they should be. And that's where social media, both organic and occasionally ads, have been pretty helpful.
That's really helpful. And given what you're saying, Karen, there's a little bit of surprise for me, at least, on how few of our survey takers said they use professional advocacy software. So for those on the webinar that have joined us today who are kind of interested in taking a different approach next year, switching up their advocacy strategy, can you all share what major improvements in engagement you saw after adopting an advocacy package or software? I think, Karen, I'm going to turn it back over to you to share your experience in particular here.
Yeah. Well, I will say that definitely we saw, I would say something like 10 to 13% growth year over year in our email list through the syncing that I mentioned. And then having a variety of phone to action tools has allowed us to pair um, the digital advocacy with in-person advocacy, and that's really been the most effective for us. We work, like I mentioned, with a lot of chefs or food personalities on food policy issues. Um, they're often working on things like hunger, sustainable sourcing, working with farmers, and so they have a built-in platform of people who care about food but may not be tuned in. Um, so, we both use sort of like um, a direct approach, like an email or a text message from someone like Andrew Zimmern, which of course increases the response and engagement rate from our list. But then being able to have them share share the phone to action advocacy through social media expands that reach hugely to sometimes thousands of people. And so that works anytime. But then when we pair it with in-person things like fly-in hill days, it helps to generate content for social media and gives it a hook so there's some urgency behind the call to action. So those have been sort of the most effective tactics for using all of the tools all at once.
That's great. I think, Eric, it'd be really interesting to hear from you, since I know you mentioned the plurality of different tools that you could use within phone to action. So I think you can take us home here and let us know if you've seen any kind of jump or spike or different strategies that you've started to take on given your adoption of an advocacy software.
Yeah, I mean, I just, have to say, we have been using an advocacy software since about 2002. And, the previous platform that we were on, at the time, when we first signed up for it, it was like a big step forward for us in our advocacy. But over time, it grew, it didn't really grow with all the features that we were looking for. And I have to say, we've been super happy with phone to action. The way it allows us to get our advocates engaged. We engage them right when they come to the website, and it helps to sign them up right away and helps to opt them into our different programs, and then the ability to reach out over the different platforms, connect us on social media, connect us through text messaging. We've just been, I feel like it's been a game changer for us as a tool.
That's kind of warms my heart to hear. Really appreciate that. This has really been a wonderfully robust discussion, but it looks like we've actually sparked a couple of questions. So I would love to take a look at our queue and see what people are asking here. And whoever wants to jump in first, feel free to do so. So first and foremost, let's see here. I think, Karen, actually, I'm going to turn this one over to you since you spoke a lot about social media. I'd love to hear if you or if anybody else has done this, talk more about paid social media and how you're using that to recruit new advocates and supporters.
Yeah, so we have used paid social in a variety of ways, because we also used sort of micro-targeting digital ads for election work previously, for communications about legislators' food policy records. And then now we have used it primarily, I would say primarily for kind of individual actions, but that have a trusted person behind them. So, like I mentioned, Chef Tiffany Derry is on our board, and when she was on the Hill, probably about a year ago, working on issues, we have a Facebook Live video with her, or another chef that is talking about how their meeting went on Capitol Hill, and that even if it is paid, it feels more organic and allows people to get a message from somebody besides just us that they can respond a little bit more to than maybe the normal ad.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Katrina or Eric, do either of you all use any kind of paid advertising on social media?
Yeah, I've got an unfortunate story on this one. Facebook in particular has not used to allow us to do paid advertising, and because of the legal status of hemp and some of the extracts and whatnot being a little bit up in the air with the FDA and whatnot, basically Facebook has shut down our ability to advertise, and it was kind of shocking for us because we weren't trying to sell any products, and we emphasized that to them, but yeah, sadly, they don't allow us to advertise, even if we're just promoting a news story. So we've done our best to try to get through their filters, but there's nobody to really talk to, and they just continue to sort of point to some policy that doesn't apply.
Yeah, I think that's a good point for everybody listening. Facebook has undergone a significant number of changes in the last, I would say, 2 years, and more on their way, especially leading up to the election. So having to come up with creative ways to drive that inorganic acquisition outside of Facebook is going to take a little bit of creativity. And I would encourage everyone who's listening to reach out to strategists, digital consultants, folks at the Phone to Action team. We're always happy to come up with those ideas. We certainly see a lot of them come in. And to Karen's point, having just even a video where people can engage with you in a different way than a call to action or a sign up form can be a really great way to get started. I think the one thing that I would like to pose to you all is, finding out how to prove the value of your digital advocacy program and any software that you're using. There are a lot of costs that go into running effective campaigns and advocacy, and it takes a lot of people and work and software to make it be effective. So I'd be curious how you all are showing the ROI of your program internally. I know, a tricky question, right?
This is Katrina. I can jump in on this one. So I think, even though I keep on saying that, like, we're trying to find like the few key people that are willing to go out there and be advocates and to really be those change makers. I think, having the amount of numbers, or amount of people, and showing those numbers to our board is really exciting for them to see that it's not just a few people that are working on this. It's like there's this big breadth of people, a wide range of people that are working on it, and to look at like where in this across the U.S. and just think Phone to Action tool can show where you have like a concentrated amount of people, or and highlights different states or regions or anything like that. And it's really cool to be able to show some of the stakeholders in my organization just the wide range of things, and get people excited about it and like what we can do and where it could go. And also when it comes to like segmenting, to see how many people are re-engaging with our stuff.
Right. I think it's interesting to consider measuring your key performance indicators outside of just conversions and advocate growth, There's so much more that a software can help you do that is for community engagement, mobilization, and advocacy that doesn't just happen during fly-ins or legislative session. So, for example, getting people at events engaged or sending out text messages around donations like Karen mentioned, and being able to package all of that together to demonstrate a comprehensive solution for your key issues and just raising awareness and education around it can be so valuable for your team.
Yeah, I'll say that one of the things that was a little bit more unusual when we used Phone to Action that's been helpful is actually using the text keywords at events, but we don't do as many in-person events. But we do put out products like our scorecards. The last time that we had the scorecard physically printed, we included the text to sign up keyword on there so that if somebody sees it, in paper, they're able to easily turn that into engaging with us digitally. We also worked with Chef Spike Mendelson here in DC for a podcast last year and talking about food policy issues, talking with chefs, sort of trying to engage a little bit more informally. And he advertised it in his restaurants here in DC and in Chicago and did little table tents. And so we included the text to sign up keyword on the table tents. And so again, turning something that somebody casually sees physically in person into a digital engagement that we can hopefully capture and get that person and get them engaged.
That's wonderful. I love to hear those kind of fun stories of issue awareness and education. Well, I think that we are nearing some time, so I'm going to wrap us up here. This has truly been a wonderful discussion. It's been so wonderful speaking with all of you all today, and we are just so excited to be able to share with you all the results of this survey. For those of you still with us, you can expect an email with this survey tomorrow. If you have any questions and you want to learn more about Phone to Action or speak with any of the esteemed panelists that we are joined with today, you are welcome to connect with any of us with the emails provided. So I want to kind of conclude everything by thanking all three of you, Eric, Karen, and Katrina, for joining us this afternoon and for everybody spending the past hour together. We hope you all enjoy the rest of your day and have a very wonderful holidays. Thanks, everyone. We'll talk to you soon.